So welcome everyone. Welcome to Neighbors. Welcome to the Arabic Studies program here at Nebraska University. This is our Zoom Interfaith Talk series for Spring 2020. I'm Abla Hassan. I'm an Associate Professor of Practice of Arabic Language and Culture and the coordinator of the Arabic Studies program. And today we're meeting for a conversation and to learn from Professor Karen Tamber-Drazino what everyone should know about Judaism. I'm so grateful for our community supporters and to our co-sponsors, Department of Modern Languages and Literatures here at UNL, Classics and Religious Studies, the Honors Program, and Digital Islamic Studies Curriculum Program, a program housed at Michigan University. So much, Karen, for joining us, for accepting our invitation. And let me start by introducing Dr. Karen. Dr. Karen is a scholar, a writer, and a teacher. She's an instructional assistant professor at the University of Houston and a scholar of the Hebrew Bible. Her research interests include women in the Bible, Second Temple literature, and feminism and the queer biblical interpretation. I'm so honored you got the time out of your busy schedule, Karen, to join us. And I'm so happy with everything going on with COVID, I would say the only positive thing for me was getting Karen as a Zoom friend. Thank you so much, Karen, for joining us. And I'm going to be recording, as I shared with Dr. Karen, for her talk, but then I'm going to pause recording for your questions. Thank you for joining us, Karen. And
thank you so much for having me.
And probably I'm going to start with the basic question I ask all our guests, very basic question: what is Judaism? And what should everyone know about Judaism? Let's start by the basics. Let's allow our neighbors to know more about Judaism.
Well, I'm glad that's your first question, because that's where my presentation goes to first, is the basics. So I'm going to pretty much skip my self-introduction because you've already basically done it. You've introduced me. Thank you. I will just mention a couple of the classes that I teach at U of H so you get kind of where I'm coming from a teaching perspective. I am a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, and so I teach classes about the Bible, an introduction to the Hebrew Bible. I teach about women in the Hebrew Bible, Bible and modern pop culture, and various other classes relating to Judaism and religious studies. And one class that I'm particularly proud of, I co-created and co-taught with a colleague at the University of Houston, a course on Jewish-Muslim relations. So far we've gotten a chance to teach it once, and I hope we'll be able to do that again. It was a phenomenal experience. And you already kind of mentioned what my research is in, so I'm not going to go into any detail there. So let's begin. Here's how my presentation is going to be organized. We're going to talk about the basics, the who, what, when, and where of Judaism. And then we'll talk very, very briefly about practices, what Jews do, and beliefs, what Jews believe. And then we will talk, we'll spend probably about half the time, half of my time, excluding your questions, talking about some common misconceptions about Jews and Judaism. And hopefully we can set the record straight a little bit, because unfortunately, you could probably fill a 3-hour presentation with all of the really strange and weird and silly things that people have come to believe about Jews and Judaism. So I'd like to tackle just a few of those. So the basics. As Dr. Hassan requested, we will start with what is Judaism. So I guess the first question is, who is a Jew? And you are Jewish if you are born into a Jewish family, but like everything in Judaism, and I suspect like everything in most religions, it's not that simple. So you are Jewish if you're born into a Jewish family, but by whose definition? there's an active dispute within different branches of Judaism about patrilineal versus matrilineal descent, which means everybody agrees that you're Jewish if both of your parents are Jewish, but traditionally, going back many, many hundreds of years, you were considered Jewish if only your mother was Jewish and your father was not. So the Jewish descent passed through the mother. But in the last several decades, some more liberal, progressive Jewish groups have said, you know what, we think you should be considered Jewish if only your father is Jewish and your mother isn't as well. So there's this dispute about, who is Jewish, depending on which parent is Jewish. You are also Jewish if you convert to Judaism, but again, not that simple. So you can convert to Judaism, but there is some controversy among different groups in Judaism. Under whose authority are you converting? Which group, what rabbi is certifying your conversion? And that can affect who in the Jewish community is considering your conversion a valid one and therefore is considering you Jewish. How many Jews are there? It's a very small group. Jews comprise about 0.22% of the world's population, which is about 13 million people. So this is a nice little pie chart of world population by religion. And if you can see at the bottom, that tiny, tiny little green sliver labeled 0.22, that is the population of Jews. So very, very small group. So where do Jews live today? Mostly in the United States or in Israel. Over 80% of Jews live there. In the United States, the most recent estimate is that the Jewish population falls somewhere between 5.7 and 7 million people, which puts it at less than 2% of the US population. So when I teach my introduction to Jewish studies, I always ask students before I show the slide, a slide like this, what percentage of the US population do you think is Jewish? And people estimate everywhere from 30%, sometimes I get an estimate of 30%, all the way down to nobody really goes below 5%. So people do find it hard to believe that the population, the Jewish population of the United States is as small as it is. It's worth noting that this map would have looked really different before the rise of Zionism, before the Holocaust, and before the founding of the modern state of Israel. So this kind of map of where Jews are really has shifted just in the last 3/4 of a century or so. So this is another kind of where map, and a disclaimer here, I did not create this map, and it's not, I think it was created by a Reddit user, but it's actually pretty good in terms of general ideas. So that's the grain of salt thing. Take this with a grain of salt because it's not from a professional atlas producer or anything, but there are different groups of Jews that are based on their geographic origins. And basically, these geographic origins are where were these Jews living in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period? Were these Jews living in Central and Western Eastern Europe? If so, they are Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenaz is the Hebrew word for the Rhineland, the area of France and Germany where this Jewish population was settled in the Middle Ages and then kind of spread out from there to other places, other parts of France and Germany, Russia, Poland, other parts of Europe. Another designation based on geography is Sephardi Jews. And Sephardi Jews mean Jews who, as of the Middle Ages, were living in the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain or Portugal. And you'll notice that the pink for the Sephardi Jews spreads also out into North Africa and Turkey, which is because Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal in the 15th century and ended up in all these other places. Turkey was one of the main places, the Ottoman Empire was one of the main places that they sought refuge. Mizrahi Jews are Jews of the Middle East, and you see there's a lot of blending of Mizrahi, Sephardi, a lot of overlap here. And then there are several independent groups that don't really fall into any of these designations. So the thing to know about these different geographic groups is that Jews from the different groups might differ in the language that they speak, or the traditional language that those kinds of Jews speak, their traditional dress, their religious practices, of course, their food, and sometimes, their racial or ethnic appearance. When can we trace Judaism to? We do know that Judaism is one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions. And the Jews can trace the origin to the Israelites in the Bible. And the Israelites have their origins somewhere roughly-ish 3,000 years ago. I'm a Bible scholar, so it's really hard for me to sit on my hands and not go into more detail here, but I'm going to keep it at this. Historians debate at what point it's actually appropriate to begin using the terms, instead of Israelites or Hebrews, as much of the Bible does, the terms Judaism, Jews, and Jewish. But we do know that somewhere between 2,200 and 2,600 years ago, those terms become popular, become widely used, and they're derived from a geographic designation, Judah. So where does Judaism originate? It's got its roots in the Middle East, specifically in the Levant, and more specifically than that, in modern day Israel, Palestine. Significant portions of Jewish tradition, thought, and literature, though, developed in places other than the Levant, other than Israel. And one of those major places is modern day Iraq, which in antiquity was known as Babylonia. A huge portion of Jewish tradition and Jewish literature in late antiquity, in the rabbinic period, developed in Iraq. That was kind of the center of everything. And there are lots of other places where aspects of Judaism developed over the years. So Egypt, Spain, Eastern Europe, and Germany are just some of those places, and there are many more. What is Judaism? This might sound like a very dumb question. Judaism's a religion, right? Well, yes, Judaism is a religion, but it's not only a religion. Well, so what else is Judaism, and what else has Judaism been over time? Judaism is described as a lot of things other than just a religion: a people, an ethnicity, a shared history, a culture. Sometimes people describe Judaism as a tribe, even. And Judaism is can be all of these overlapping things, and there are a lot of different ways to be Jewish. What do Jews believe? Well, that's a tough question. One important thing to know is that Judaism is not a creedal religion, meaning that there is not one statement of faith or detailed description of belief, as there are in, for example, Christianity or Islam, right? Islam has the Shahada. Christianity has lots of creeds, like the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed. Judaism doesn't really have a comprehensive statement of faith or statement of beliefs like these religions do. The closest that Judaism comes is something that comes out of the Bible, called the Shema, which is incorporated into Jewish prayer and practice today, even. And it basically is translated here: "O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." And that's kind of it. It's very, very, very basic. And one might argue that that is not even really much of a creed. It is one statement. Judaism also, and we'll return to this in a few moments, Judaism is an orthopraxy rather than an orthodoxy. So an orthodoxy means correct belief. Orthopraxy means correct action. And the emphasis in Judaism is not on what a Jew believes, but on what a Jew does. So with that, we'll transition into, okay, what does a Jew do? What is Jewish practice, or rather, what are Jewish practices? Because when we talk about Judaism, like when you talk about a lot of other religions, you really want to talk about plurality. So one thing to know that is a little bit different than some other religions is that there are a lot of home-based rituals in Judaism, a lot of things that you do inside your house and with your family. So Jews just celebrated a couple of weeks ago the holiday of Passover, and Passover is almost entirely a home-based holiday. You're celebrating with your family at home by holding a Passover Seder. And yes, some people go to synagogue, but mostly the big way that people celebrate is with their families at home. And that's pretty common. You usher in the Sabbath by lighting candles in your house. So one way that one system of Jewish practices is focused around life cycle rituals. So, for example, there is a whole set of rituals that surround the introduction of a new baby. If it is a boy baby, there is a Brit Milah, otherwise known as a bris or a ritual circumcision on the 8th day of the little boy's life. If it is a girl baby, there is what's known as a baby naming ceremony or a simchat bat, which means celebration of a daughter, to welcome the child into the Jewish people and into the covenant. Another life cycle event would be a bar or bat mitzvah. So bar for boys, bat for girls. It is the point at which a Jewish boy or girl at the age of 12 or 13, depending on the tradition, becomes a Jewish adult and is bound to follow Jewish law. And it is when that child comes and is called up before the Torah and reads from the Torah for the first time. So like this young lady in the picture is doing. Of course, there are life cycle rituals that surround all sorts of other events. There are very specific Jewish ways of getting married or, if need be, getting divorced. There are specific Jewish rituals that surround death, dying, mourning. And there are also rituals for conversion, for joining the Jewish people. Another really important aspect of Jewish practice is the Sabbath, or Shabbat in Hebrew, which is a day of rest when Jews are supposed to refrain from work, business, any sort of commerce like spending money, and just kind of relax. The Shabbat nap is a time-honored tradition that I try very hard to obey. Not always possible. So there are also many Jewish festivals, and the most important ones are generally come in the fall. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. They're called the high holidays. They're so important. Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, coming just 10 days later, is the Jewish Day of Atonement. And if you think that two major holidays 10 days apart is super inconvenient for anybody going to work or school, well, you would be right. It is, in fact, incredibly difficult and inconvenient for people to manage. And if that's not enough for you, the next holiday on my list, Sukkot, comes 5 days after Yom Kippur, and is also a major holiday. So the holiday season is rather busy. And there's actually something else another one I haven't even mentioned that comes right after Sukkot. So it's basically the whole fall season is very difficult for planning and all that stuff. So Sukkot, Passover, Shavuot are three other festivals. They're actually festivals that are named in the Bible and that were supposed to be festivals in biblical times when everybody left their homes for a while and went up to Jerusalem and gathered at the temple in Jerusalem and celebrated. There are other festivals as well. You might be saying, wait, I've heard of Hanukkah. What about Hanukkah? We'll talk about that in a few minutes. It's actually an extremely minor Jewish holiday. So I will mention it, but in the service of talking about how minor it is. There's also kashrut, which is keeping kosher, the dietary laws. And I know a lot of people are coming from the Arabic Studies program today. So a lot of the laws would probably sound very familiar. And the idea of having a series of dietary laws would probably sound very familiar if you are a practicing Muslim, because kashrut and halal are very similar. There are even some of the same prohibitions. Next, prayer. Again, this will be familiar to people who come from the Muslim tradition. So prayer, traditionally in Judaism, prayer is conducted 3 times a day, in contrast to Muslim 5 times a day. And where Muslims will pray toward a holy city, Jews also pray toward a holy city. In the case of Judaism, that is Jerusalem. Study is also a key element of Jewish tradition. So there is a kind of a commandment, even in Jewish holy texts themselves, that you're supposed to study Jewish holy texts. You're supposed to spend a significant amount of time learning and studying. And the idea is that you really never have learned enough. You can never stop studying. And even in Jewish ritual practice, Jews read the entire Torah, the 5 books of Moses, every year. And when we finish, what do? We start again. You read the whole thing over again. So studying basically does not stop, and you can always learn more. There's always ways to approach the text. There's always new texts to read because there's a very, very large corpus of rabbinic literature as well as the Bible. And another interesting and important Jewish practice is ethical behavior. The Bible contains a lot of ethical precepts about how you're supposed to conduct yourself in all manners of life. So marriage, child rearing, business ethics. You're supposed to care for the most vulnerable people in society, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. And another very popular concept in Jewish ethics is tikkun olam, or repairing the world. So this is the idea that somehow at some point things got kind of messed up in the world, and it is the special task of people, especially Jewish people, to repair those messed up things, make the world a better place. So you'll note in my little banner on the top, I mentioned that those practices can vary very widely. So you may say, oh, I know some Jewish people and they don't keep kosher. They love cheeseburgers, or they don't keep Shabbat. We love to go out to restaurants on Friday night and Saturday. So not all Jews practice Judaism the same way. And somebody may identify very strongly as a Jew and practice some of these things, or practice, all of them, or part of Judaism. And so one of those is, of course, God. Judaism believes in a single God who is indivisible, that is no Trinity as Christianity has, incorporeal, so God not having a body, and God as a being who created the world and is eternal. So God not having a beginning or an end. Another core Jewish belief is that the Torah, or the Bible, was given to the Jews by God. And Jews will differ about what that means. Jews might differ on does that mean actually, literally dictated by God to Moses, who wrote it down, brought it to the people? Does that mean divinely inspired? Does that mean, well, we actually don't think that the Bible is divine at all? It was written by humans, but we think there's something special about it. Very, very wide spectrum of Jewish belief. There is a belief that there's some kind of special relationship between God and the Jewish people, but one caveat is important here. You don't, in Jewish tradition, need to be Jewish to be a good person or to achieve, and I put this in quotes, salvation, because salvation is not, in fact, a Jewish concept at all. There really isn't a concept of being saved. God is considered to be the source of wisdom, healing, and forgiveness. So if you want those things, they are supposed to come from God. Jews do espouse a belief in general in a Messiah who will come and usher in some kind of perfect age. So in Judaism, that Messiah is not supposed to have come yet. So Judaism awaits a Messiah. Judaism holds a variety of beliefs about the afterlife, but in general, in Judaism, we don't talk too much about the afterlife or about the Messianic age. Judaism is very much a this worldly religion. I think in that way, it's got something in common with Islam. So here we'll move on to the common misconceptions about Jews and Judaism. Abla, is it okay to go into this part of the presentation now, or did you want me to pause now for questions?
Yes, go ahead. Maybe we'll leave the questions to the end.
Okay, great. Yes. Okay, so I've got several misconceptions here, and they come from various sources. So some of them are based on misunderstandings of history or events that happened in history that people are not aware of, and they don't know how those things are coloring their beliefs today. Some of these misunderstandings come from a conflation of Judaism with other religions, or trying to understand Judaism using a framework that was developed to understand another religion, and usually that religion is Christianity. Some misconceptions are based on conspiracy theories, conspiracy-based myths, and some are mistakes of a single story. So, for example, you have met 3 Jews in your life, and all of them have red hair, so you say, Jews must have red hair. So it's based on getting only one story, not having enough of a diversity of knowledge or opinion, and then coming away with an incorrect or very limited impression of what Jews are like or do or think. This actually happened to me a few years ago. I spoke to a church youth group and about Judaism, and there were some adults in the room, and one of the adults during the question and answer period raised her hand, and you might notice I have a very long hyphenated name. So this woman raised her hand and she said, so I've met a few Jewish people and they all have hyphenated names. Is that a Jewish thing? It's not. Spoiler alert, it is not. But she had met a few Jews and all of them happened to have a hyphenated name. So she kind of concluded that that was a Jewish practice. It's not. It's just a coincidence. Or if anything, Jews tend to be on the left-leaning edge of the political spectrum in the United States, as do people who hyphenate their names. So maybe that had something to do with it, but it was a single story mistake. So the first misconception is actually 2 misconceptions. I've paired them because they're related. So Judaism is basically Christianity minus Jesus, or we can understand Judaism by reading the Old Testament. So no, Judaism and Christianity do share some common texts, but they have had 2,000 years to develop separately, and they have. Judaism and Christianity are very distinct religions, and they are not different only in the Jesus aspect. There are many, many other differences. It's also true Judaism is not frozen in time at the completion of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament or at the rise of Jesus. Judaism continued to develop and continues to develop even today. The most obvious difference is that the Bible and the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament contemplate a temple in Jerusalem, which was the center of Jewish practice. It was a place where Jews paid obeisance to God by offering animal sacrifices. The temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, 70 AD, by the Romans, and that destruction meant a transition from a religion that was based on sacrifice to one that was based on study and prayer. So you really cannot understand Judaism simply by reading the Old Testament, because if for no other reason, and there's lots of other reasons, there's no temple anymore. So Judaism is not a religion that is based around sacrifice anymore. Jewish readings of the Hebrew Bible also differ very much from Christian ones. Even if you look at the very first story in the Hebrew Bible, the story of Adam and Eve, Christians read the story, tend to read it as kind of the beginning of sin and a fall, and Jews do not. It is a very different interpretation. So you can't understand Judaism today by just reading the Bible and kind of calling it quits there. Judaism, it's worth mentioning, is a lived religion and a living religion with many variants. None of those variants really look much like biblical or Jesus era religion. The next misconception is a really big one, and that is the Jews killed Jesus. So, of course, at the time of Jesus's arrest and crucifixion, the land of Judea, where the story takes place, was under Roman control and not native Jewish control. The Jews, because they were living under the Romans and not independent, lacked the power to execute somebody as an enemy of the state. Also, crucifixion was a Roman method of execution, not a Jewish one. So if even if Jews did have the power to carry out an execution, it would not have been by crucifixion. Jews did not execute that way. That was a punishment that Romans kind of reserved for people they wanted to make an example out of, for people who were considered heretics or treasonous or in some way enemy of the state. So the New Testament states that some Jewish authorities saw Jesus as a threat, and that's possible. Some Jewish authorities may have seen Jesus as a threat, and they may have gone and urged Rome to deal with him. But that does not mean that the Jews writ large killed Jesus. The New Testament does imply that there is some kind of collective responsibility and collective guilt. Most strikingly, in the Gospel of Matthew, the Jews who are present at the condemnation of Jesus say, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." And that verse has been used throughout the centuries to justify persecution of Jews by Christians. Post-Holocaust, many Christian groups have been repudiated the idea of collective guilt, most notably the Catholic Church. So they've kind of realized that, oh wow, this is something that we need to specify, even if there were some Jewish groups, some Jews at the time who wanted Jesus kind of taken care of. That does not mean that the Jews killed Jesus, or certainly that all Jews in all times bear some kind of collective responsibility. We also have to consider, when we consider what the New Testament says, that the writers of the New Testament were actively trying to attract Gentile followers. So they may have minimized the Roman involvement in Jesus's death to kind of make the Jesus movement seem more attractive to those Gentiles. The next misconception is one that I hear a lot from my Bible students, my intro to the Hebrew Bible students at the University of Houston. God is mean in the Old Testament and nice in the New Testament. I hear this a lot. So there are many examples of a loving and compassionate God in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And likewise, there are many examples of a vengeful and violent God in both sets of scripture. The erroneous perception that God in the Hebrew Bible is mean or especially cruel is really based on cherry picking. And you can cherry pick holy texts to say almost anything. I think it's erroneous to pick out some verses and say, this shows that God is really mean and cruel, and that there's a Hebrew Bible God of wrath and a New Testament God of love. That cherry picking that often happens is done largely because of what's called supersessionism. Supersessionism is the belief that the New Testament replaces the Old Testament, that the New Testament God is different or nicer, kinder, more loving than the Old Testament God, and that Christianity replaces Judaism as a valid religion. It's a pretty harmful idea, but one that's also really widespread. So next one, and we've already talked a little bit about this, Judaism is mainly about faith. So it is true that there are some religions that are mainly about faith, but Judaism is not one of them. Again, we have the orthodoxy, correct belief, versus orthopraxy, correct action distinction. And Judaism is an orthopraxy, so correct action. Belief is an element of Judaism, but even those people who don't believe are urged to engage in Jewish practice. Even if you don't believe, you are urged to keep the Sabbath and keep kosher and observe the holidays and act ethically and study Torah, etc. It is entirely possible to be a practicing Jew who is deeply committed to Judaism and not believe in God. So I think we have to be careful not to treat all religions as if they follow a Christian model of faith, which does tend to place more emphasis on belief. Another misconception: Jews call themselves the chosen people as an expression of superiority over others. No. Jewish sources dating back to the Hebrew Bible do say that God chose Israel above other nations. But what that chosenness means has been interpreted really differently. So some Jews argue that it means Jews have a special responsibility to follow the biblical laws, and that's an obligation that other peoples don't have. I saw an analogy the other day that I really liked, that People who live in America have the obligation to follow US law, and people who are living in Canada do not have that obligation. I think it's a nice way of thinking about obligation and what that chosenness could mean. Others suggest it means that Jews have a special mission to be a light unto the nations and to be a good example and to convey teachings kind of to everybody and to repair the world. Most Jews would probably reject the idea that there's some kind of innate superiority that is carried by the term the chosen people. Okay, here's a whole set of misconceptions that revolve around Jews and money, and they take lots of different forms. So Jews are cheap, Jews are good with money, Jews use their money to control the world, the government, the banks, the media, you pick your institution. I've got some illustrations here. This one kind of lends itself to art. So the stereotypes about Jews and money, it's really important to trace this back to where it begins. And where it begins really is the Middle Ages. Jews living in Christian Europe were kept out of most occupations except for merchantry and money lending. And the concentration of Jews in those occupations allowed them to become wealthy, but it also engendered hostility towards them because do you have student loans? If you have student loans, do you like the people who hold them and then come to collect on them? Probably not. So money lending did not exactly endear Jewish money lenders to the Christian population. They were not really popular before that either, due to kind of a long tradition of Christian anti-Judaism. So you see this money lending stereotype and this idea of Jews as predatory in some way come up all over the place. So, for example, The Merchant of Venice, one of Shakespeare's plays, they made there was a performance of it, I believe, in New York City a few years ago with Al Pacino in the lead role, and the lead role is Shylock, this anti-Semitic caricature. So related to this, stemming from this perception, is also this idea that there's some kind of Jewish ability with money. And you might see these as positive stereotypes about Jewish business acumen. They're pretty common. And you see them even in places where there aren't very many Jews at all. So just a couple of examples. I ran into this book in a used bookshop a few years ago, and I was really, really horrified at it. Like, oh goodness, I can't believe this was actually published and this actually exists. And it was published in 2009. And then this is a picture of a section of books of business tips with a Jewish motif at a bookstore in China. Now, there are Jews in China, but not a whole lot. But there's still this idea in China, the stereotype about some sort of mystical Jewish business acumen. So you might say, oh, these are positive stereotypes, it's okay. But I would argue not. When I teach my students in Introduction to Jewish Studies about the stereotype, I ask them to throw out so-called positive stereotypes about their own ethnic groups. And we talk about, well, what's the flip side of this positive stereotype? It winds up limiting people because people think that that's all you can do, or it somehow turns into something nefarious. And there's a lot of potential for the stereotype about Jews being good with money to turn into something nefarious. And we see that with, for example, a forged document from the late 19th century called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. This was a forged pamphlet, not genuine, but it purported to be a record of how the Jews would use their money to take over various institutions of society. So government, banks, media. And even though this was fake, it was completely fake, it was a lie, it spread very far, very wide, very quickly. And in the United States, it was helped along by the famous automaker Henry Ford, who was also a huge anti-Semite. And he actually reprinted the protocols in the house newspaper of the Ford Motor Company. And if you went to buy a Ford at a Ford dealership, you could actually find the protocols sitting in a newspaper, that you could take. So this spread far and wide. Thank you, Henry Ford. It also spread to Germany and influenced Nazi propaganda very heavily. You can even buy this thing on Amazon today. As you see, there's this book, and it's illustrated with a very anti-Semitic caricature on the front. So conspiracy theories about Jews and money are still really widespread today. If you've been following any of the nonsense about QAnon, there is a Jewish conspiracy theory angle to that as well. Any conspiracy theories that mention the Rothschild family or George Soros, those are Jewish individuals, and they are they're even if they don't say, the Jews control the world, anytime you see anything about the Rothschilds or George Soros, you're going to see that's kind of a dog whistle. So again, not based on fact, but very pernicious. The next misconception is that Jews and Muslims are eternal enemies. This is not the case. Jews and Muslims have lived alongside one another in many different lands and have had a variety of interactions like people do, positive ones, negative ones, and just everyday neutral ones. Historically, in fact, Jews have fared a lot better under Muslim rule than under Christian rule. And there's a variety of reasons for this. For example, Muslim treatment of Christians and Jews and other people of the book is actually written into Muslim Holy Scripture. There is no such protection for Jews in Christian scripture. And in fact, there's kind of this long tradition of blaming the Jews for the death of Jesus. So as you can imagine, we don't have to imagine, we know that this didn't exactly go well for the Jews living under Christian rule for most of history. One could argue, in fact, that Judaism and Islam have more in common with one another than either one has in common with Christianity. One could argue that, and I would argue that. So the rise in extreme Jewish-Muslim tensions is really relatively recent, and it stems from a confluence of factors. So the clash of the Zionist ideology and pan-Arab ideology, the founding of the State of Israel, and Israel's dealings with the Palestinian people, relations between Israel and its largely Muslim neighbors, and how those largely Muslim neighbors dealt with the Jews within their own borders when Israel was founded. So there's a lot of factors here, but I think it's important to understand that this, any animosity that we are seeing today, it's sometimes framed to us as like the age-old religious conflict, and it's not an age-old religious conflict really at all. So another thing, all Jews support the modern state of Israel or support Israel in the same way. So it is true that the majority of American Jews do express support for Israel. 7 out of 10 American Jews say that they are very or somewhat attached to the state of Israel. However, a lot of Jews do express some discomfort with the current right-leaning government of Israel. So many American Jews would say that they support Israel, but do not necessarily support all the actions of Israel or support the leadership thereof. There's really a very wide variety of Jewish groups that work on Israel issues in the United States, from the really famous one, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. It's the major pro-Israel lobby in the United States, and it tends to be somewhat right-wing. It kind of just goes with what the current government of Israel is doing at any given time. To J Street, which is further to the left, they describe themselves as pro-Israel, pro-peace, all the way to pretty far to the left, the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a group that is actually anti-Zionist and pro-boycott, divest, sanction. So the BDS movement is about boycotting Israel and Israeli goods and Israeli academics, divesting from Israeli investments and sanctioning Israel as a nation. So you actually have a Jewish group that is advocating that position. So pretty big, pretty broad spectrum. And another thing I found really interesting was somebody did a study during the Trump administration and found that American Jews were more likely than Christians to say that the Trump administration was favoring Israel too much over the Palestinians. So a lot of the most right-leaning support of Israel in the United States actually is coming from the evangelical Christian community. Another common misconception, and we are coming kind of to the end here, just a couple more. So this is really important. The misconception that all Jews are white. The majority of American Jews are Ashkenazi, which means their ancestors came from Eastern or Central Europe and are generally perceived as white. And so when Americans think about Jews, they usually are thinking about Ashkenazi Jews and Ashkenazi Jewish culture. So people think about Jerry Seinfeld and Sarah Silverman and Seth Rogen and Barbara Streisand and bagels and lox and matzo ball soup and noodle kugel. All of these are people of Ashkenazi background and Ashkenazi foods. Jews have lived all over the world, and there are actually Jews of every race, every color. And the majority of Jews in Israel actually are not Ashkenazi. The majority of Jews in Israel are Sephardi or Mizrahi, so people who trace their ancestry back to the Iberian Peninsula or back to some part of the Middle East. Judaism also, of course, accepts converts, and those converts have helped to make Judaism an even more multiracial religion. A recent study actually from last year, 2 years ago, estimated that 12 to 15% of American Jews identify as Jews of color. And that surprised a lot of people, but it looks like the population of Jews who do not identify as white is a lot larger than anybody thought. Just a visual illustration of not all Jews are white. So you have here, this is a picture of Ethiopian Jews in Israel celebrating the unique Ethiopian Jewish festival called Seged. Here is a group of Indian Jewish men praying. And here's Tiffany Haddish, the comedian who very famously a couple of years ago released a comedy special called Black Mitzvah about her adult bat mitzvah and her embracing her Jewish heritage. So I saved this one for last. So we're finally coming back to Hanukkah here. Misconceptions that Hanukkah is the Jewish Christmas, and the Last Supper in Christianity was a Passover Seder, so Christians can connect with Jesus by holding their own Seders. Hanukkah is actually a really minor Jewish holiday that has become a big deal in the United States due almost entirely to its proximity on the calendar to the Christian holiday of Christmas. So it's actually quite minor and is definitely not the Jewish Christmas at all. And if there's any kind of moral to the story of Hanukkah, it's that it's a story of resistance to assimilation. So it's very ironic that people see it as the Jewish Christmas. As far as the Last Supper, the evidence that Jesus's Last Supper was a Seder, in fact, is actually extremely thin, especially because the Seder meal, the Passover Seder, as we know it, probably didn't develop until many years later. Jesus's Passover celebration would have looked nothing like Jewish Seders of today, because if for no other reason, then the temple still stood at the time of that Jesus lived. And so the Passover celebration in Jesus's day would have looked like an animal sacrifice, and it would have centered around the table. It wouldn't have been this home-based Seder meal that we have today. The practice of Christian Seders it's become very, very common in the last few decades, where Christian groups, churches will hold their own Seders and reinterpret the Jewish symbols of the Seder in light of Christianity and in light of Jesus. And for some Christians, they see this as a way of connecting with Jesus and connecting with the Jewish roots of Christianity. But I should say that many Jews, and I might even guess that most Jews, find that kind of Seder very offensive. So not only is it historically extremely problematic, but it is generally seen as kind of cultural appropriation and religiously really, really offensive. I've got a few resources that I will put up for you if you would like to learn more about Judaism or Jewish history. And I would like to take questions as well.
Awesome. I have one question. So what's the originality of the words? There are like many different terminologies with Judaism, and also with Islam. You know that the origin of the words are Arabic, right? But with the
You're talking about the connection between Hebrew and Arabic language?
No. Oh,
I'm
so
sorry.
it's Hebrew. It's Hebrew, right?
So,
the origin of the terminologies in like Judaism.
yes, Hebrew.
Hebrew.
Yeah.
Where is
And
that?
so there's a lot of similarities in the Hebrew and Arabic languages because they're both Semitic languages. So yeah, you're gonna see a lot of that.
Okay. So
Thank you so
Hebrew
much
is the answer.
Thank you so much for your question, Omar. And I bet we have a lot of questions. As I promised you guys, I'm going to pose the recording for questions. But first, I would like to thank Dr. Karen so much for the valuable information. And thank you so much for clarifying misconceptions and misunderstandings about Judaism. This fits exactly one of the big goals we're holding this interfaith talk. Thank you so much, Karen. I think if someone asks me to clarify misunderstandings about Islam, they will never hear the end of it. I don't know where to start from in my list. You did a great job. Thank you so much. We're so honored to have you as our guest here. I'm going to pause the record for more questions from our guests.